It can be complicated to define a genre as wide and broad as science fiction, but let's give it a try. From many points of view, one thing is very clear, is that it stands outside of the parochial here and now that appears to be the obsession of so-called mainstream literature. This didn't used to always be the case. For thousands of years, as far back as the Bible, the legends of Gilgamesh, Murasaki, the Eddas, the Hindu legends, we have 4,000 to 6,000 years of literary history, and almost all of it dealt with fantastic elements. Heroes and gods doing things that were definitely extraordinarily different than the parochial here and now. What changed? Well, in the 17th, mostly the 18th, and then the 19th century, you started having authors like Thackeray and Fielding who were delivering stories about people who very much like those who were reading the book. Why did that come about? Well, I have my own theory, and that is that about that time, life changed for the average reader in Europe and America. What happened was that up until that point in time, life itself was extremely fragile and unpredictable. You might be healthy one day and simply drop dead the next. You might lose everything. But the shape of civilization, the pyramidal social order, that would be constant. Well, starting in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, this reversed. The social order went through ructions and transformations, and yet people started to actually get a sense that of their 5 children, 3 or 4 of them were highly likely to live. There was more and more stability in life. And so you started seeing so-called mainstream literature focus in on daily life. Now, that didn't mean fantasy went away. You had Gulliver's Travels and so on, leading to the woman we call the grandmother of science fiction, Mary Shelley, and Frankenstein, which was scientifically inspired fiction about science transforming our relationship with the world. Followed by the 2 dads of science fiction, Verne and Wells. And clearly what they did was science fiction. Science and technology drove and propelled what they were talking about. And yet, the older tradition of fantasy, Lost Worlds, L. Rider Haggard, and all of that continued. And it continued into comics and the fantasy that we see today. They go to the same section of the bookstore, comics, fantasy, and science fiction. Yet much is said about the difference between these genres. And one aspect is that science fiction, while it keeps with the broad perspective, the drama of characters doing things that are beyond the normal daily life. Nevertheless, science fiction breaks with the old tradition of Homer and Achilles and all those legends, because they were largely about demigods and gods and uber beings, Nietzschean uber beings. Whereas science fiction started talking instead about us. It started saying, all right, the main character here is above average, perhaps one of the scientist characters in Jules Verne's stories, but only above average, not a god. And the crew and team that he or she puts together is going to do something marvelous, using tools that some other team could replicate, some other group will replicate. It's the notion that is in science fiction that the premise might change. The basics of life might change. So you see what I was mentioning earlier, that society was starting to change over the course of a single person's generation. Your son might enter a profession that you had never even heard of. Your daughter might take for granted social mores that would have been shocking to your mother. Jane Austen touches on this possibility in Pride and Prejudice, and then shies back away from it. Lizzie boldly deals with the hypocrisies of her time, but never attacks the basic premises of her time, even though they had been different 20 years before and would be 20 years after Jane Austen wrote the book. Her characters do not question the fundamental premises. The fundamental premise of science fiction violates this and violates the premise of fantasy and comics going back to Homer. And the premise is children can learn from the mistakes of their parents. Now, others have said that they believe science fiction is different than fantasy for other reasons, the furniture and all of that, the technological tools that are used. But by that token, Star Wars would be science fiction. Please. It's fantasy. Children don't learn from the mistakes of their parents. The fundamentals of the Star Wars tale are pure fantasy from beginning to end. Nietzschean, uber, demigods, and gods are the only important characters, and as a private person, your only choice is which group of demigods you can fight for. Star Trek, on the other hand, is science fiction because the topic in almost every episode is, how are we being different? How might our children make different assumptions than we make? How are we going to question the rules under which we're operating? This issue of whether or not children can learn from the mistakes of their parents, you notice I said can, not will they. Because science fiction is very good at developing what's called the self-preventing prophecy, the dire warning. And that is On the Beach, or Dr. Strangelove, Soylent Green, Silent Spring, George Orwell's 1984. These were all terrifying stories that had the purpose, and they achieved it, of frightening millions of readers or viewers into deciding they are going to expend some of their effort for the rest of their life to making sure that this failure mode won't happen. And arguably, we're here today because the failure modes that could have led to nuclear war that were exposed in Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, and On the Beach were paid attention to. And then those stories made themselves not happen. They were self-preventing prophecies. All sides of the political spectrum embrace the imagery of Big Brother and the dire warnings about tyranny that Orwell warned us about. And the only difference between Republicans and Democrats is which kind of power center that they think is trying to become Big Brother. Government or oligarchs or corporations. But they're all concerned about that same dire warning. So, in these dire warning stories, children don't learn from the mistakes of their parents. They make new mistakes that are horrible, that are terrifying, like in Soylent Green, wrecking the world. But the implicit assumption is they could have not made this mistake. Now that makes for a more chilling kind of tragedy. Have you read Aristotle's Poetics? He has one about histories and one about tragedy. The volume that was lost was about comedy, and that was the theme of the movie and book, The Name of the Rose. In the Poetics, Aristotle defines tragedy as being typified by the play Oedipus, where Oedipus is doomed from the beginning of the play to follow a path that cannot be avoided. Now, when you watch Oedipus follow this foredoomed path, you weep because it's meant to extol, to draw sympathy from you. And the play is still fantastically effective. But a modern person raised on science fiction is tempted to leap on the stage, put a bullet in poor Oedipus's head, and then go hunting gods for having done this. The premise is this didn't have to happen. And of course, some science fiction shows children learning from the mistakes of their parents and making a better world, as in Star Trek. This is a fundamental difference that breaks from the old tradition, fantasy, comics, Homeric fairy tales that you see in almost all ancient tribes. They all had the fantastic. And they followed Joseph Campbell's arcs. And they were predictable. And even though science fiction follows these same arcs of the fantastic, science fiction breaks from these arcs in ways that, when I get to part 2, I'll lay out in a little more detail.